Okay, welcome everybody to today's lecture, which is about proofreading the final draft of your CP. Yes, things are moving quite rapidly now, so we're kind of entering the final lap, if you will, when it comes to the group project at least. So as my favourite Scottish chef, Gordon Ramsay, likes to say, try and finish the last dish you're cooking in the restaurant as if it's your first. So in other words, let's try and finish strong. Let's not go out with a whimper. Let's keep taking the feedback on board and making sure that we make everything as strong as it can possibly be. So in today's lecture, I'll be talking to you about a number of different things. So by the end of the lecture, you should be able to do this. You should be able to edit, proofread, and revise your CP so that it matches the requirements of the final draft. You should be able to eliminate basic recurring errors, spelling, grammatical errors in your CP that we continually see from draft to draft. Hopefully at this stage, through using some of the techniques and exercises I will talk about today, this should really be the end of it now for some of those recurring errors. So I've mentioned it in previous drafts. I gave everybody a fair bit of slack in terms of eliminating basic stuff. I've tried to flag up when it's occurring and encourage people to check and proofread throughout their work. But when it comes to the final draft, it really is the final draft in that respect. So although obviously I'm there to help polish it after the fact, it's really your responsibility to make sure that it's handed in a kind of professional way, which indicates that this is the best that you can possibly do. So I'll help you in that process today by just introducing you to some basic hints and techniques related to proofreading and editing. As you probably know by now, that is one aspect of my professional life, I guess, in relation to working here at the Javier. I also run my own English proofreading business for academics. So what I would say is a lot of these techniques are techniques that I directly use in my everyday life, both here and in my private work. And whilst you may see some of the stuff and think, oh, this is basic, we kind of know that, often basic points are actually really, really helpful. So keep in mind when I show you some of the stuff today, I can't emphasize enough how much these simple techniques add up and add up in the sense of dramatically improving the quality of your final drafts that you would hand in. So I would really, really strongly urge everyone to engage and try and practice some of the particular techniques that I will show later. Now, I've mentioned before that it can be quite useful to try and allocate that role to a specific person. Although that is good, what I would encourage is that everyone takes ownership and responsibility over the final quality of the CPs. It's everyone in your team's responsibility to make sure that it's the best it can possibly be. So it might be a good idea to try and incorporate some group activities in relation to the more personal proofreading activities I show you later. Now, as part of that proofreading, it's not just a kind of pragmatic, practical, kind of boring technical thing. It can often seem like that, of course, like, oh God, Chris, you're just going on about spelling and grammatical errors. Well, that's true in one respect, but I happen to think that proofreading is also really about editing. So I often equate it to like a producer who's working with an artist and is helping them to refine their sound, to improve the quality of the instrumentation, their vocal, in every level of the track or album. This is exactly the same when you're engaging in your own editing and proofreading. So what I'm saying is that practical technical work directly impacts upon the quality and the actual content which is in the CP. So keep that in mind. It's not a distinction between we need more content and information versus basic proofreading and polishing. I want you to start thinking about these things in combination with one another. Proofreading, editing, revising directly contribute to content, to quality, and to making the information more readable, more accessible, and making your arguments stronger. Okay? So through some of the exercises that I'll draw your attention to at the end, hopefully you guys can engage in this for yourself. I also want to say for you guys watching live and also for those people watching a little bit later, I will be providing links to these proofreading and editing exercises later on Facebook. And I take these from Edinburgh University, my old homeland. And as I say, I use these techniques myself and have used them over the years with students. So I would highly recommend checking those out. But again, I'll put the links on Facebook so you can do that in your own time. Now, obviously, this week you're getting feedback on your fourth drafts. You're either getting that via OneDrive, or everyone is getting that via OneDrive, rather. And some of you are also getting that via Team Talks over Zoom. So once again, I would just encourage you to engage with that feedback and also try and resolve some of the feedback. So if you feel like you've resolved an issue and it's a fairly straightforward issue, then just resolve it and delete those comments. So I have to say, for the most part, overall, everyone's getting much, much better at doing that. So each time I look at a new draft now, the page itself tends to be blank and tends to be clear. There are still some instances in which comments are being left. Sometimes that's fine. People are asking me a direct question. But for the most part, if there are old comments that are no longer relevant, just try and delete them at this point. It can just become a bit confusing for me when I'm looking at stuff. Okay. And of course, there are some deadlines, upcoming deadlines. So most importantly, in relation to the group components of the minor, is the final draft of the CP, which is on the 22nd of November. So keep in mind, most of you have all had feedback now on the fourth draft or third draft, depending on what stage you're at. Those teams who are still have a little bit more time, I've contacted you today. Some of you have got back to me. Some of you can get back to me later, clarifying what your progress is and what stage you're at. But yeah, ideally, once you get that feedback, you still have a decent amount of time in order to work on the final drafts of your CP. Okay, so for most people, this will primarily involve synthesizing the survey data and the interview data that you've all been collected. Again, people are at different stages of that, but that will make up a big part of the work that you'll be doing. But another huge part of that process over the next 10 days or so, or 2 weeks, is about revising and proofreading and editing. So keep in mind, I'm only I'm one person as such. So obviously I'm providing feedback over quite a lot of teams' work. But keep in mind, just because I don't mention something in relation to a particular section, that doesn't always mean that it's perfect. If I was to go over every single sentence of every single CP, things would just never get done. So keep in mind, the responsibility and onus is also in you guys to be revising and editing stuff for yourselves. So does this read well for us? I know Chris hasn't said that this is wrong, so to speak, but could it still be phrased better? Could it be clearer? So this is from the introduction all the way through different sections. Again, some sections you will of course had 3 or 4 different forms of feedback on now. But again, keep working on it, keep revising it, and keep editing it. So most importantly, what you'll find sometimes is that arguments that seemed really important 3 weeks ago are suddenly or have suddenly become less important. Arguments that didn't seem particularly significant in the CP a month ago have now become incredibly important because of the survey data you've received, because of the interviews that you've maybe conducted with your scholars and your cross-cultural leaders. What you might find is that a certain idea that seemed really small about maybe a shift in leadership styles in your country has now actually become one of the main arguments that you're talking about in one section or perhaps over 2 or 3 sections. So what you might find in that instance is that you need to go back to your introduction and maybe think, okay, can we add in some breadcrumbs for the reader that perhaps set up those discussions that are to come later? So you want to make sure that that balance and that emphasis is consistent across the CP. Also, you really want to be aware of what is being written in the different sections of your CP. So again, you want to think about this as an overall piece of work as opposed to just separate sections. So you want to make sure that things aren't repeated. You want to make sure that certain arguments are perhaps carried through into the different sections of the CP. That's the kind of gold standard we're looking for. It really shows that people are viewing the CP as an overall project and as one piece of work, and that you're in charge of it. You know the arguments that you're making, you know the evidence that you're citing, and ultimately you know the story that you're trying to tell. That's really the kind of the high standard that we're looking for. But there is time to do that. That's what I'm trying to highlight here. Deadline is coming up. And obviously, as you guys have all got in a good habit of doing now, please make sure that it's in the correct folder, and please make sure that you only have one document in that particular folder. Also, if there is a deadline, please, and if there are problems with making the deadline, then please let me know in advance. Okay, I won't name and shame anyone, but there was an instance this week of me working on a draft which was in a folder which turned out to not be a real draft at all. So please try and help me out in that respect. If there isn't anything, if your final draft isn't ready, then don't have it in that folder, because you know after the deadline I'll then be providing feedback on that. So try and communicate with me in advance to make sure that I'm not doing double work on some things. And of course, at this stage of the process, you're now starting to understand that ultimately you're working on a finished product. So this is really important, I think, in terms of a mindset now moving forward. We're in the final lap, as I say. And from now on, every time you're working on sections, revising them, editing them, I want you to be in that mindset that this is the finished draft. I want you to be in the mindset of, I'm writing something here which is going to be complete, which is going to be read by someone. And someone is going to want to read something which is clear, which is logical, which follows on from one another, which is clean, i.e. it isn't messy and full of errors and so forth. So really start visualizing the fact that you're writing on an overall document now. Yes, different people, of course, have responsibility for different sections, but you want to make sure that you're communicating to everybody. Are all the sections up to the same standard? Are people taking on board different feedback in relation to different sections? Is it applicable to your section as well? So from now on, as I say, really be focused on the idea that you're delivering a finished product in the next couple of weeks. So it's your last chance, if you haven't already, to really kind of fall in love with the book as such. Okay, in a couple of weeks, the group book project will be over, and you'll be moving on to other aspects of the course, the stream tasks, and also you'll be moving on to other courses and other things that you've got to do, exams and so forth. And I would hate for you to look back in a couple of months and say, I wish I'd put in a little bit more time at the very end to polish up the CP and make sure that it was included in the book, for example. So I know everyone has different things going on. It's a difficult time we're in as well, of course, but just for this last period of time, as I say, try and let's finish strong. So try and give your absolute best right to the end. Okay, and ultimately, eventually, the book that you guys will hopefully be a part of will be in a bookstore like this here. So again, when you're visualizing that final product, also try and visualize an actual concrete book that will be held by someone and read by someone in a university, in an airport, maybe in the future. But this idea of a real tangible book, how do you want it to look? How do you want to represent yourself? Your name will be attached to this. Does it represent yourself in the best light? Would you be proud to put this on your LinkedIn page, to put in your CV in future for people to go look at? So keep in mind, the book reflects upon all of us in that respect, everyone involved. And as I've mentioned before, there are multiple different sources of help that are available to everyone. So please continue to go back and look at the various sources of information that are there. Yes, we had the CP clinic last week on the third draft, but it doesn't mean that some stuff in there isn't still relevant and valid to what you're doing now. So if you haven't looked at that already, then please go back and have a look at that. I show examples of previous CPs to show how they synthesized data, how they included academic evidence, survey data, and interview data in multiple sections of their CP. You can literally see it on the page what the final product should look like, what the standard is like that we're looking for. So have a look back at that material. Have a look at the old CPs that are on OneDrive or also that are available online to look at. Check out Xander's writing lecture. Check out my previous CP clinic lectures as well. All of this can be really good material for you to make sure that the CPs are up to the standard that they need to be. You've also got the style guide in textbook as well, which again shows you how to cite percentages. It shows you how to italicize native terms and include English translations and brackets, for example. Overall, most people are getting really good at that. But again, there can always be room for improvement. So check out that stuff again when it comes to working towards the final draft. And again, different people, of course, are very often writing different sections, but you need to ensure, and the responsibility is on you guys as a team, to make sure that the writing feels like it was written by a single author. So there are different ways you can do this, as I've recommended before. You can have a singular proofreader, editor, for example, your CP poet, who could be primarily responsible for going through that work after the fact and making sure that it's consistent, there's a consistent tone, there's a consistent level of quality in readability, for example, and making sure that it's polished in that way. But also I would recommend everyone taking collective ownership over it. So talking to each other in your teams, working your way through exercises. What are the 3-4 points or arguments, for example, that we're trying to make in this section? What would be the 4 topics for these particular paragraphs? Are these relevant for the section we're looking at? Do we have enough evidence for this? If we don't, maybe we need to take that point out, for example, and focus more on the information we do have, making that stronger, making that more polished, supporting that through stronger arguments. So I want you to really engage as a team in this final process to try and make sure that it feels as tight and as consistent as can possibly be. So it looks something like the ball of books that you see on the screen. And a lot of this is about readability, okay? So readability is a very broad concept. Previously, I've talked about it in terms of not writing too informally and also not writing too academically, but it's also about content. It's about making sure that the content you're writing about is relevant to the topic of business leadership. Now, many of you now will have seen comments like this over and over in various drafts of your CP, and that means that that still needs to be addressed. Similarly, over the last week, some of you will have seen that particular comment in relation to your local leadership bestseller, where I'm reminding people, keep in mind, guys, this is a book which is going to be read by a broad readership who are interested in management. They're interested in organizational management. And it's very easy to go off track and to drift into other areas of leadership, political leadership, and so forth. But in most cases, and this is not true for everyone, but in most cases, you should be able to find local bestsellers that are on business leadership specifically, and make sure that your discussions are geared towards highlighting aspects of business leadership in your country that would shed light on it for a broad readership. So I'm picking any country at random. If I don't know about Qatar or I don't know about Liechtenstein, in that local leadership bestseller, you just want to summarize 3 or 4 points that help to simply and clearly give some insights and takeaway messages about what leadership might be like in those countries. In what way is it like how you might imagine it is? In what ways does it differ from some of the popular stereotypes and representations of that country? Just interesting details and facts, but crucially are linked to leadership and management. So when I say readability from now on, keep in mind that's what I'm talking about. Clarity, tone, but also content. Is it appropriate for a management book? And again, I didn't show this last week, but I thought now at this proofreading stage, it's really interesting now to go back to George Orwell's 6 questions that he thinks every writer should ask. So George Orwell of 1984 in Animal Farm fame, who was famously really against super fancy writing. So the first question is, what am I trying to say? So a lot of you will have seen similar comments like this from me. Clarify your meaning here. That's all I'm meaning. What are you actually trying to say? If we were talking face to face in a cafe or in a classroom and I asked you about this sentence, how would you describe it then? And why can't you describe it in a similar way in the CP? Sometimes less is more. Sometimes simplicity is better. Again, think about the words that you'll use to express this in a clear way. So this is about readability and tone. Don't be too informal when you're expressing things, but equally don't be too super academic. Either of those approaches will lose the reader. And you'll get a comment from me saying, oh, it's maybe too informal, guys. This is too conversational. It's a management book. Or you'll hear me say, guys, this is too technical. Okay? So what words will express things? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Okay, so a nice way of thinking about this for our CP would be illustrative examples. So again, I keep saying this over and over, and I love when people respond to that feedback and show me examples in future drafts. What example will help make this point clearer that you're trying to show? If there's been a shift from one leadership style to another leadership style, is there an example that summarizes that shift, for example? If leaders are autocratic, transformational, transactional, concerned with their employees' well-being, do you have an example about your country specifically that shows how that happens in an everyday organizational context? Is it a good example? Is it a fun example? Is it an illustrative example? Is it concrete and about your country and about no other country? That's what we're interested in. Make it impactful, make it strong, and make it worthwhile being in there. That relates to the next point. Is it impactful enough? So again, if we're going to use common expressions, try and use ones that are impactful. Try and make ones that you would actually enjoy to read, that are going to capture a reader's attention, capture a reader's imagination. And again, could I put it more clearly? Now that I've having written that sentence, 1 hour later, if I go back to it, could I make this point more strongly, more clearly? Could I simplify it? Should it be 2 sentences rather than 4 sentences? Could I have 1 longer sentence rather than 2 shorter sentences? Is it clear? Is the language clear? Would someone who doesn't know as much about the country as I do, would they know what I mean here? And again, finally, have I said anything that is ambiguous? Is it unclear? Does it sound vague? Do you finish the sentence and kind of squint your eye and your nose and go, yeah, I don't really know what that's about, but I need to move on to another section because I'm rushed for time? If you feel that intuitively, if you know that you're not sure what you're writing about, if you can't answer yourself, why does that need to be here? And what does it tell me about leadership? Trust your instinct. I genuinely believe that most times people know when they're waffling, people know when they're making stuff up, people know when they're being a bit unclear, or if they don't have an example. So what I'm asking you to do is to be honest with yourself. Try and rephrase it. And if you still can't express the point you're trying to make, then it probably means the point doesn't need to be there. And it then means you need to dedicate your time and energy to working on the other stuff that does make sense, that does shed light on leadership in your country. So at this stage, and this is very different now from being in the second draft, if it's still not clear in your section, if you still feel like there's whole elements of certain discussions that don't link to anything, or that aren't linked enough to the topic that you're meant to be writing about, at that point, they need to come out. Okay? It's too late in the game to be spending time on that now. Quite simply, they need to come out. Okay, so just to reiterate some of these different things, I'm seeing some stuff flash up in the chat, guys, but as I mentioned at the beginning, try and not use the chat function today. If you have any comments, just email me after or post it in the comment section on Facebook, okay? Just because I'm recording it live and it kind of detracts from the flow of it. So speaking of flow, what we're looking for is that flowing, coherent and compelling narrative. So again, does it flow? Is it a nice story to read? Now later on, I'll show you an exercise that you can use in order to make sure that your topics link to one another and that they flow from one another. Okay? Sometimes certain discussions at the bottom should be at the top. Sometimes what you talk about first should actually come at the bottom. So I'll show you some exercises you can do to figure that out for yourself. Ultimately, it's up to you guys to say, what story are we trying to tell in this section? What point flows from one to the other? So as I already said, you want to make sure it's for a broad readership. Later on, I'll talk again about some examples of how you can proofread and edit your paragraphs to make sure that they're well structured, that they're coherent, and that they logically flow from one another. Try and use native terms. People are getting much better at this, but again, we'd still like to see it in some of the other sections. So if you have good native terms and expressions, if your interviewees or scholars mention good examples in native language, then again, incorporate these in the CP and include the English translation in brackets. Remember, these native terms and expressions are some of the ways through which you can make your chapter unique from another chapter. Okay. Synthesis is incredibly important. Again, some of you will be getting feedback where I go, excellent synthesis, very good synthesis. This is what we're looking for. What that means is that you're now incorporating different voices into your story. So this country used to be autocratic, according to this scholar. This scholar, a different scholar, argues that in recent years, things have changed and leadership styles have begun to be more like X and Y. This point was supported by our survey respondents. 50% of whom reported that they did X and Y in their organizational life. That's an example of synthesis. You're drawing upon 2-3 different sources there in order to tell a story that becomes more and more specific as you go along. Ideally, it should end with a concrete, specific example about leadership in the country that you're studying. Now, I just want to flag your attention to some of these again, and I can directly tell, based on the third draft feedback last week, that some people have checked out these different transitional phrases and are now using more of them in your CP. I would encourage all of you to check these out on OneDrive, and again, I've shown some examples here that you can use to compare and contrast ideas, how you can illustrate a point, how you can give further examples or clarify something you said. So you could say, in other words, or what I mean here is. You can emphasize or expand ideas. This is really important. So you could say, this is important because what this tells us is that leadership isn't a singular phenomenon in this country. There are multiple different types of leadership depending on the region, or depending on whether you're in this half of the island, which is controlled by the French, or this half of the island, which is more controlled by Dutch influences, for example. So emphasizing, summarizing for the reader, why is this important? What does this mean in the grand scheme of things? Another nice technique, and I've mentioned this to a couple of teams this week, is try and establish chronology. And all I mean by that is try and create a nice timeline, a logical timeline that talks about how leadership has developed over the century, over the last 50 years, over the last 10 years, to what it's like in your society today. So having that chronology helps in terms of creating that narrative flow. It's logical. You're describing the development of a country over time. Now, obviously, you don't want to go into great detail. You don't have to go back to the 14th century. But you might want to talk about, okay, what shifts have there been in the last 30, 40 years? Why might this be the case? What have scholars argued? How do some of our interviewees talk about this? What do they think have driven those shifts and changes in recent years? What do these changes look like? What is leadership like now, therefore? Then cite some evidence from your surveys, interviews, and so forth. And again, just finally, I want to flag up the idea of summarizing and concluding. This is a really nice way of ending paragraphs. What does this indicate then? Does this tell us that leadership is a straightforward phenomenon? Does this tell us that leadership is complex? Does this suggest that there are contradictory practices in a country? On the one hand, the survey respondents are saying there's no gender inequality here. Everyone can be a C-level manager if they work hard enough. But in another respect, your two interviewees, a scholar and a cross-cultural trainer, says there's still lots of gender inequality in the country. There are no female C-level managers, for example. What does this indicate? Try and sum up. Try and clarify. What does this tell us, therefore? Is there a reason for this contradiction? Okay, just show, summarize, conclude, sum up before you move on to talk about something else. I understand it's a work in process. You're getting a lot of detail. But this is the type of work I'm obviously trying to do with you guys and help you guys with. So here's some other useful templates that you can use. This comes from the downloads folder, transitional phrases. Have a look at these in your own time. See how you can incorporate some of these into your CPs. And then also there's the phrase bank. So we posted this on Facebook last week, specifically at that time in relation to the survey and how you would look to incorporate your survey respondent data into your CP in different sections. But this could just as easily relate to other data, like your interviewee data, for example. So again, these are just some standardized phrases that you can use, tweak, and adjust to suit your style of writing, of course, and to suit the story that you're telling, okay? So again, engage with those materials that are already there. For a more wider, expansive kind of academic phrase bank, I've also provided a link here on the slide. So by all means, feel free to take a quick picture for a moment or to start typing that already into your kind of search engine. So this comes from Manchester, University of Manchester, and it's just a much larger phrase bank, and it's a really great resource if you're writing academically. It provides example phrases for how to introduce examples, how to cite supporting arguments, how to incorporate and synthesize interview data, survey data, and so on and so forth. So again, really nice resource that I would recommend. You can just Google Phrase Bank Manchester as well, and it will come up. Also, keep in mind you're writing in UK English rather than American English. So that can be confusing because sometimes you might be reading and paraphrasing from academic sources that are writing in US English. So keep in mind, once you paraphrase it in your own CP, you need to try and make sure that you're using UK spelling. So obviously use the spell checker in Microsoft Word. Make sure that you change it to UK English rather than US English. But there are also lots of other online sources you can use. The Oxford Dictionary of English, Collins English Dictionary, and so forth. So if you're unsure about a word, just Google it, have a look and see how it should be spelled. And of course, there is always textbook. Have a look at the bibliography chapters, have a look at the style guide, again, to see in a kind of more concrete sense how you cite percentages, whether it's commas, whether it's decimal points, and so forth. Lots of little details there that don't seem like much in and of themselves, but they just add up. They contribute to a bigger picture. Okay, getting all of these small things right matters. The aggregate of that is really important in terms of presenting a professional looking final draft. So I've been showing this throughout the course now in kind of 2-3 lectures that are dedicated to feedback and also writing tips and things. And in today's lecture, I'm going to unpack some of these in a bit more detail and look at some practical examples and also some exercises that you can do to implement these different stages of reviewing and editing your CP. So there's stage 1, just checking that things have been answered. Is the question been answered? This section is about hierarchy, empathy, how do they characterize leaders? Have we actually done that here? Have we focused on that content? Is there content that perhaps belongs in another section? Should we take that out, scale it back, and save it for that section, for example? Most importantly, are the arguments you're making supported by sufficient evidence? So again, we talked about the kinds of evidence that we're interested in. Textbook has examples of references that aren't allowed, that Xander doesn't want to see in your CP, red references as he calls them. So again, have a look at textbook for these, make sure that you don't use them. The second stage is focusing more on structure. Is the structure coherent? Does it make sense that this topic and argument is here as opposed to here, for example? Does each sentence and each paragraph link on to one another? Is there a logical connection between them? So sometimes this can be as simple as using transitional phrases. We will now move on to talk about this. Or another example of what leadership is like in this country is blah, blah, blah. Just the way you begin the sentence and phrase it suggests to the reader that you're moving on. Okay? Summarizing one particular sentence or paragraph also says to the reader that you're kind of tying a bow in that you're finished with that, and that you're ready to move on to something else. And again, I'll talk about more concrete examples that you can use to make sure that the structure and also the grammar and punctuation are correct. And I'll show those in a little moment. Okay, so ultimately, as I say, we're now at the stage where every time you're writing something, I want you to visualize and think about the fact that ultimately you're writing a final draft of your document now. For most people, a couple of groups are a little bit further back, but it's always a good idea to have in your head, what might the final product of this look like, and how can we make sure that ours is up to that standard? Now, if you want to check that, have a look at previous CPs, as I've already mentioned. That will show you what the final product should look like in terms of formatting and also in terms of quality. Okay, so I implore everyone to have a look at that. Next thing you want to do is you want to check the content of your CP. As I say, make sure that your argument and evidence are sound. Is that content appropriate for that particular section? If that content isn't adding to the story you're telling, and is actually it's sometimes derailing the story, because you very nicely had 2 paragraphs that follow on from one another, and then the third paragraph goes off into something else entirely, then that might mean that that third paragraph doesn't really belong there. Okay, and unless you can very clearly link it to the other ones then perhaps it shouldn't be in that section. Perhaps it might not even be in the CP. And of course, that can be frustrating if you feel like you spent time and effort on that. But at the end of the day, if it's not telling your story and if it's not relevant, then at this stage, you need to become quite harsh with your own work. Okay, we've had 3 drafts, 4 drafts now to try and make this point work. It isn't working. We keep getting feedback suggesting that maybe it needs to go, for example. Or maybe we need to try really hard one last time to make it explicit. How does this link to leadership, for example? So you want to review the structure and organization, of course. Logical flow is everything. And also, you want to make sure your references are correct. So as it comes to the final draft, that's going to be something that we're also more harsher about. Not harsher, but just a bit more stricter about. So keep in mind, you have a bibliography tip clip, about 20 minutes long. You have a separate bibliography chapter in textbook that again shows you concrete examples of exactly how you should reference in text, exactly how you should present direct quotations, and exactly how your bibliography should be structured. We even have sample bibliographies in textbook that show you the references in alphabetical order. They show you how to reference journal articles, websites, interviews, surveys, books, any sort of thing you can imagine. So again, please use those templates and customize them to fit the source that you're using. Now, in terms of introducing some more practical, useful editing tips and techniques, again, I want to just emphasize that I know in isolation, when you see these, you might think, Chris, come on, we're knee deep in producing our 4 for final drafts here. It's all about getting content. It's all about getting that missing information. And by comparison, these might feel small, trivial, pedantic, or that I'm just being, or I have some kind of syndrome that I'm obsessive about commas and full stops and stuff. It's not that. It's just that I happen to think, as I said earlier, that reviewing and revising and editing your work is as, if not more important than what content you shove in. Just shoving content in that you think might say something about your country isn't enough. It needs to be logically presented. It needs to be sound. It needs to be well written, and it needs to be thought about. Okay, so using these basic techniques that I'm going to mention are really helpful in terms of changing your mindset about the importance of proofreading. So what I want to emphasize is that proofreading and editing aren't just a kind of last minute job. Okay, guys, we've got half an hour now. Go for it and just eliminate commas and full stops. What I'm putting forward here is something much more than that. It takes a little bit of time. It takes certain conditions, certain atmospheres, but also certain mindsets. So what I'm saying is treat it seriously. It is an important job, okay? So the first thing I would recommend is taking a break. Very simple point, but how often do you and me in our everyday lives not do that? We just keep plowing on with something. Our concentration's gone, we're agitated, we're frustrated, we make mistakes, we become sloppy. You can't afford to do that as you get to the final draft. So as I said before, and now I would encourage taking even more time, please give your proofreader or proofreaders much more time to view the final product. So if you're 3 or 4 or 5 days before hand-in, maybe just stop working in terms of adding more content for half a day and just say, okay, the proofreaders are now going to spend half a day taking their time and working through everything here. Does everything make sense? Is this logical? Could we think of a better example here? Is there any quotes from our interviews or from our surveys that could help to emphasize this point? Once you then have that polished and improved, you're then able in the next day to go on and start adding more content and maybe linking additional content. But at least then you're adding content on good foundations, good, solid, logical, structured foundations. It's much easier to do that than to keep adding content to stuff which isn't well structured. That just creates more confusion, more frustration for you. And I'm trying to help you avoid that. So give the people time is what I'm saying. Allow them take a break. The rest of the team can take a break from it and hand it over to those people. Okay, so get in a relaxed mindset, put on some nice relaxing music that you like, get yourself in a nice chair, a nice location, and start reading through it calmly, slowly and with a fresh eye. The next thing, and I highly recommend this as someone who's now losing their mind a bit, continually working from home, and I know that there are challenges to doing what I'm doing in the context, but if you can, when you go to proofread, edit, and revise something, take yourself literally out of the location that you've been working on up to that point. So say, okay, I'm now going to go sit on a balcony if you have a balcony, or I'm going to go sit in the living room if you've been working in your bedroom, or vice versa. Take yourself somewhere different in the home, in a different chair, in a different environment, in a different sitting position, even, and look at the document in that way. I do this myself all the time, and it just helps to keep things fresh. I think subliminally it just sort of calms your mind and you're viewing it from a different perspective. Another tip in relation to that is also maybe change the size of the screen. So perhaps try reading it in a different format than you've been working on. One technique I sometimes use is to make documents very small. And that way you get a little bit more of an impression of 2 pages sometimes rather than just 1 page. And again, things look nice and clean and quite complete in that way. And you kind of feel a bit like a surgeon who's just making specific adjustments to something as opposed to writing on a big page, which feels more for major adjustments. But again, everyone's different. Perhaps you would prefer the opposite, having a bigger screen where you can more clearly spot errors and mistakes. Just do something that works for you, but change location, okay? If you can. Another really good thing, I myself prefer working on screens, and sometimes different screens, different sizes, different formats, example. But some people still like to print copies of their work. So if you do, there are printing shops around, obviously, in shops, and some people have printers in their own home. So if that does work better for you, and I'll show you an exercise later that utilizes this approach, then perhaps print it off. Again, I just think it helps to give you a different perspective on what you've been working on. So having a physical, tangible, printed version of it. I think it also helps to encourage you to think of the idea that, this is what someone might be doing in future. In 5 months' time, they'll be reading a physical paper copy like they have now. Okay? So if you do find that helpful, then print the copy off and read over it in a different way. Okay? Now, I know I've mentioned this in several team talks and several lectures talking about writing and editing. But again, I just want to reiterate how important it is to read your work out loud. Again, it just changes the nature of things. You hear it out loud, which is very different from reading it on a screen all the time. It just changes, I think, your relationship to the writing. So I'd really recommend just reading it slower. Reading out loud is slower than when you read silently. Okay? Simple point, but it's quite an important point in this context. So read it out loud, read it slowly. And what I think this does is it helps you focus more clearly on each word, as opposed to skim silently reading over a document. You tend to skim over it like an ice skater on an ice rink. This is about reading out loud. You hear if things sound odd, if they sound clunky. You go, that phrase sounds weird. Is there a better word that I could use to better express that? Or say, I wonder if that's too informal, saying that there nowadays. Maybe I could use a different term that Chris has mentioned, right? And so I think it helps to change your relationship to it. It helps you see if things are too long, if they don't make sense, or if they're just poorly written sometimes. So what you'll find is if the sentences are too long, is that your breath, like mine's now, will be all over the place. You won't know when to pause for breath. You'll be out of breath. You'll stumble. And all that means is that the sentence is too long. Sentences, for the most part, should be a nice mixture of short and long. This also helps to create flow. So if it's too long, you'll know within 5 seconds if you read it out loud. And once you do so, try and think, where would be the natural pauses here when I'm talking? At what point is the sentence too long? When you probably run out of breath. So maybe think, okay, maybe the full stop should be there. Maybe then I can start a new sentence. Then go back, read that out loud, and so on and so forth. Okay. Again, for me personally, it's a really, really great technique for helping improve the clarity and the readability of your writing. So I would encourage everyone to do that. Another thing would be to use text-to-speech software. So if you don't want to read it yourself, use text-to-speech software and have the machine read it back to you. Sit down, listen to it out loud as it's read back to you. Does it sound strange? Does it sound long? Could something be improved and corrected? So I highly recommend that one. This is a slightly stranger one, but as I will show later in one of the exercises from Edinburgh University that I'll highlight, reading backwards is something which is recommended quite a lot in the editing and reviewing and proofreading business. So what do I mean by that? Well, I literally mean that you start at the end of your CP. So you start at the final sentence of your empathy section and you read the actual sentence. You read the sentence forward. Can't read backwards, that'd be a bit weird. You read it forward, but you read it from back to front. So you read the last sentence in your empathy section, then you skip and you read the sentence that comes before that, and so on and so forth. And again, it's a really slightly counterintuitive idea. Don't get me wrong. It might seem strange. You might be thinking, what is Chris on? What is he smoking here? But genuinely, give it a try. And what you'll notice is it just, again, helps you look at the document in a different way. So it'll help you spot spelling and grammatical errors because you're focused much more because it's a different way of reading. So it forces you to read more carefully and closely. And also it's a nice way of having a look at whether sentences link on from one another. So when you read the second sentence first, then you read the sentence before it after that, it might then become clearer if they actually relate to one another or not. So again, if you think I'm mad, that's fine. I understand. I probably am in some ways, but give it a try. Just try it on your empathy section later today and see if it's helpful for you. That's all these techniques are about. Just trying to show things that have worked for me and others in the past and that will hopefully help you all improve the quality of your CPs and achieve what you're trying to achieve. Now, obviously, use spell checkers. So spell checkers are important. They help to eliminate most of the basic stuff. Some spell checkers also have grammar functions where they will give you recommendations for how to condense your arguments, reduce words, say things more simply. But I really also think that you shouldn't overly rely on these things. You also have a responsibility, and I think you will also benefit from individually reading through your work at the same time. Learning to spot these errors without spell checkers is an invaluable skill. It's an important skill to develop. And I think, again, it changes the relationship to your document because you're looking in a very focused way. And the more focused you look at something, the more you're likely to pick up on errors or things that can be improved on. So these are three kind of different elements that we've talked a little bit about checking ideas, arguments, and evidence. That's number one. About checking structure and composition, number two. And then three, the more practical thing of checking for spelling, grammar, and referencing issues. So what I want to do now is to move on and to kind of mention some of these in a little bit more detail. So the first element refers to what I call active reading. So much of the time we engage in passive reading, particularly on phones. We scroll, we're very quickly skimming and scanning over information that we think is relevant for us. Now that is a practical skill. You can't read everything with great purpose and that level of detail because you would never get anything else done. And also when you're skimming through academic research, often you have to try and extract the key information quite quickly. But for proofreading the final draft of your CP, you need to shift away from that more passive reading towards more active reading. So think of when I'm giving you feedback and when I'm sometimes making changes to your document, that's an example of active reading. I'm looking through to say, do things make sense? Is there an example to back this up? Is that good evidence or not? Could there be other evidence to support that? What I'm doing, I want you guys to also do for yourselves, okay? And why I think active reading is good is because it forces you to read with a specific purpose. It's purposeful reading. So you're not necessarily doing all these things at once. I'm going to check for paragraph structure while I also check for spelling and grammatical errors. What I would tend to do is isolate your active reading. So say, okay, on this active reading read through and proofreading, I'm just going to focus on sentence structure and narrative flow. Is it coherent? Do the different paragraphs link to one another? Is there good supporting evidence and arguments there, for example? Then you might say, okay, we've done that. Next day, you might say, now I'm purely going to look through to look for spelling and grammatical errors. So again, it's about being purposeful and intentional in what you're doing. And this will help you identify all of those little mistakes that might feel trivial on their own, but add up and contribute and give off an impression of your overall work. Okay, so don't let that kind of stuff drag down all the hard work and all the good research you've done. It does matter. Okay. And why I also think this is invaluable is that because it forces you to read your work more than once all the way through before submitting. So almost all the teams are really involved and working together and working hard. But I suspect there will be, and kind of quite naturally, there might be elements of your own CP that you just haven't thought about in a while, or you just haven't really ever read over yourself. You might say, well, this introduction is the responsibility of person X. The hierarchy section is the responsibility of person Z. Every week we get feedback and we go in the team talks, and when it's mentioned, I go, oh, they didn't really do that then. Or, oh, they've done that really great. That's good to hear. I haven't really read that section. At this stage, that can't happen anymore. So everybody needs to be exactly aware of the overall product, of how all the individual sections tell a story about leadership styles and practices in your country. So before you hand in the final draft, every single person in the team should have at that point read over the whole document, hopefully multiple times. And if you truly do that, so many basic errors and logical problems will be addressed. Absolutely promise you. Now, as I mentioned there, see it as working in different stages. Don't see it as, okay, I'm going to carefully read through and look for sentence structure, paragraph structure, and spelling issues, and check whether the references are good quality. You're maybe spreading yourself too thin. You've got too many things to look out for, and things will fall through the net, so to speak. So again, focus on specific sections. Is our argument and structure clear? Is it coherent? Separate proofread would be, is the spelling and grammatical stuff good? Third proofread would be, are our references sound? Are they written properly? Are we citing properly? Are these in the bibliography, for example, if they're mentioned here? So 3 different purposes, 3 different types of active reading. Okay. So when you're reviewing content, that first kind of stage, ask yourself these kind of questions. These questions mirror a little bit what Orwell was talking about earlier. 1, have you discussed the required content for each section of the CP? So if a section is on empathy and there's very little discussion of empathy, that's a problem at this stage. You need to get the whole team together to figure out, can we find some data on empathy quick? What about the surveys? What about the interviews? What about the local bestseller? What about the YouTube reviews? Is there content in there that we can add to this section in order to tell the story? Okay. Similarly, is there content in a section that doesn't make sense to be there? Is there too much discussion of hierarchy, for example, in the characterized leader section? Is there too much discussion of empathy in the hierarchy section? If there is, and it seems strange to you as the reader and as the person who's wrote it, probably your intuition is right, and you need to take that out and incorporate it into the correct section. Have you supported your claims with evidence? So again, of course, it can happen. You write 1 or 2 sentences that aren't linked to a reference. Try and not have that be a common theme throughout. Every 2-3 sentences or so, you should be making clear to the reader through in-text referencing who and where you're getting that information from. So when you're making certain points, support it. If there's a point and it isn't supported by an academic source, an interviewee, or survey data, then the quality of that point and the validity of that point is weakened. Doesn't mean it might not be true, but it's not supported. How will we know? Okay, so remember, part of what you're being marked on is your research and academic skills. Support arguments. Have you used appropriate evidence? So just using any old evidence also isn't always an answer. So just saying, well, this particular magazine also said this point. We're also thinking about quality of evidence. So again, I refer you to textbook, where Xander talks about so-called red references, those references that he doesn't want to see in the CP. And again, the final point, have you considered alternative perspectives or tried to explain why something might be the case? So I kind of alluded to this earlier. If you have an argument flowing throughout your hierarchy section that says there is a high degree of gender inequality, and I'm picking this at random, in Slovakia, it's always been the case. It's based on patriarchy there. It's based on its past Soviet status. And amongst the older generation, there's still a high degree of gender inequality. If you then turn around in the survey section or your interview with a scholar section and say there is no such thing as gender inequality in Slovakian organizations, that's a contradiction there. You have two pieces of evidence, perhaps, that are saying two different things. What we'd like you to do is to be aware of that and to try and provide an explanation for that. Might there be some reasons for this, for example? Now, it doesn't mean that they're always going to be completely right. Sometimes you might be speculating, but there's nothing wrong with being tentative. One reason for this might be that the majority of the respondents who took part in the survey were male, and therefore perhaps the fact that they don't believe there is gender inequality is a product of that, as opposed to not being any gender inequality, for example, because other evidence seems to suggest that there is strong gender inequality in Slovakian organizations. So show your thinking. If something isn't tied or is incomplete, then it feels incomplete as a reader. You go, they haven't explained that. That's the last thing we want to see now. So make sure that sections are complete by saying something. What does this mean? What does this tell us? Okay, why might there be a contradiction here? Do we need more info? Whatever it might be. Now, again, reviewing structure. It's obviously a very important separate phase as well, just focusing on structure. And I'll show an exercise in a moment which is quite fun, but also serious, that will help you to do that. It will require some scissors, maybe some glue, sticky back plastic and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's useful nonetheless. So you need to make sure that things are presented in a logical and coherent order. Hopefully now, based on 3 or 4 different drafts of feedback, based on numerous team talks with myself and Xander, hopefully now you'll have a better understanding of what I mean when I keep going on about that. Things logically flowing from one another. Why do you go from talking about this to suddenly talking about this? Make that link. Okay, so if the reader can't follow what you're trying to say, you won't be able to demonstrate that you understand. And again, remember, that's the whole point. You need to show that you have some understanding, that you've done research, and that you know to some degree what leadership is like in Germany, France, Bangladesh, whatever it might be. So the readability of it, the structure of it, is just as important as the content that you have in it. If you have good content, but the reader is not able to really figure out what the content is, that's not good. Similarly, if it's beautifully written, but there's no content there, then there's no substance. So you need to get the happy marriage between the two. Okay? And again, please keep in mind, each point you make and each piece of evidence you present should logically follow from one another. So again, I'll show you an exercise in a moment to help with that. Now again, these slides, I've shown them in numerous CP clinics now, but again, I really recommend having a look over the sections that you already have, even if you feel like you've had okay feedback or good feedback on it. Again, as I say, I can't talk about every single sentence in every single CP. That's absurd. It would take far too long. And again, that would just be me doing everything for you guys. So I'm making general comments. Sometimes they refer to specific sections. Sometimes those specific points also refer to other things. So it's about taking ownership over your own work and seeing, okay, can we keep improving it? So what I'd recommend every team to do, regardless of how well you're doing, is have a look at each section on its own and think, what are the 4 topics or points or 5 points that we're trying to talk about in our hierarchy section? What are the 4 points that we talk about in the empathy section? How are they structured? Do we have evidence to support each? Are there examples that illustrate both of these points? Might it make sense to talk about these points in a particular order? Okay, these are the sorts of things I'd like you to think about in relation to paragraph structure. And again, I'll leave that on the screen just for a small moment while I take a glass of water. Again, this tries to practically show you through color coding and through subheadings on the left-hand side what a kind of paragraph should look like in terms of having a very clear topic sentence. So if your topic sentence is Islamic cultures, values, and customs are incredibly important to leadership in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, whatever it might be, that's your topic sentence. Your first general point might be to then go on and expand upon that in a bit more detail. What sorts of values and customs? Is it humility? Is it about looking after the well being of everyone? Is it about living your life in an ethical manner? The specific example might be how one, two, three, or all of those customs and values that you've mentioned in the sentence before specifically impact upon Saudi Arabian, Qatarian leadership practices. How might a leader be humble in their interpersonal relationships with employees, for example? Then you might have a second point. So this might be something that says something like another example of how Islamic values and customs impact upon leadership in the country is through the idea of Sharia law, or through the idea of the gendered hierarchy, for example, that may or may not be linked to Islamic values, customs, and so forth. Then your next point in green is to illustrate that. Show what you mean by that. Show a nice practical example, a concrete example from your survey, from your interviewees that say, this is what we're talking about here. This is how a leader that I knew did this in their practice. And the conclusion is about summing up. What does this tell us, therefore? Well, in my conversation there, it tells us how important in a day-to-day sense, in organizational cultures, Islamic values, customs, principles are. And you've shown direct examples. You've referred to academic research. That's how a paragraph should look. Then you're able to go on to talk about something else. Another crucial element that impacts upon leadership in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Slovakia, Bangladesh, wherever it might be, is the issue of hierarchy, or is the issue of being a visioneer, or having charisma, or being autocratic, whatever it might be. Just structure, logical, moving on. Okay, I said enough about the reviewing spelling and grammar thing for now. I've hopefully already reiterated that numerous times, and I'll show you examples, more importantly, in a little bit that will help you to do that in practice. The UK spell checker thing, I do want to reiterate, please make sure you're doing that. I'm still seeing numerous examples of Z spellings of words in CPs. It happens, it's fine. Sometimes I'll flag them up, but keep in mind, if I only flag up 2 or 3, it doesn't mean that there are more in the CP. It would just take up too much time, and it would also just be too many comments on the right-hand side of your screen. It would just overwhelm you in terms of what you're focusing on. So keep in mind, if I make a certain point about a spelling or about looking at style guide, you should go through your document and make sure that there are no other examples of that. So please make sure on Microsoft Word that you're using the UK version of that. And these are just some examples, some stereotypical examples that emphasize the differences between US and UK English. Most notably for us is organize and organization. So organization almost all times should be an S in UK English. But there are numerous other examples. And again, if you Google them, you'll easily come up with some lists that will help you. Now, reviewing references is a crucial part. Keep in mind, as I said, there's a whole chapter and textbook on this. There is also a tip clip on this. And again, there are numerous examples from all the lectures I've done where I've shown best practice examples from previous CPs that within those examples show how things should be referenced properly. So again, I would really encourage you at this point of the game, at this stage of the course, it's really important now that you make sure that these are perfect. So again, if you haven't already, try and make sure that you have the person in your team who's allocated to that role to be going through the referencing. Eventually, once it's proofread by me, and then once it's eventually proofread by the final editor in Italy, what you want to avoid is her getting back in touch and saying these 5, 6 references are wrong. This information here doesn't come from that source at all. Because what that then does is it just leads to much more work from you after the fact. And at that point, you'll be moving on to work on different things, your stream tasks and things. So it's easier to take time now, is what I'm saying, to fix these problems now than it will be later, because it can delay the final printing of the book. if we need to be chasing up specific references from specific teams. Okay, and if you have any questions, if you try to find a source and you're struggling with an aspect of it, you can't find the answer in textbook or that, just drop me an email. I'm not that bad a guy. I can try and help you. Again, these are some other useful links. I already put these in textbook in the chapter on bibliography. These take you directly to the APA, American Psychological Referencing website. And again, they show you certain things of how you do stuff. But remember, the first port of call and the version of APA that we're following is all in textbook. All the examples are there. You just need to rinse and repeat them to suit the particular references that you have. But very often that's just changing the name, the year, etc. All the commas, all of that sort of stuff is the same. Now, as we head to the end of today's lecture, I just want to show a couple of practical examples of exercises that I think would be really useful for you guys to try and engage in relation to proofreading, editing and revising the final copies of your CP. So at this point, I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint, and if you bear with me, I'll just transition to showing these particular slides. So I'll stop sharing and then I'll go back to sharing again. So 1 second. Here we go. So in no particular order. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to here is these proofreading tips. So some of them I've already mentioned, and as I say, I'll talk you through them. I'm trying to make it small on the screen so that I can include as much data as possible. But keep in mind, I'm going to put the links to these up on Facebook when I post the lecture. So you can have a look at these in your own time and try and work through some of the examples. Again, some of them I've mentioned, some of them are different. So the first thing they mention here in the proofreading tips is to print it out. Okay, so print it out on paper changes your relationship to it. The other thing is try and write down on post-it notes some of the consistent faults that have maybe kept coming up across the drafts. Does Chris keep going on about awkward sentences? Does Chris keep going on about style guide, how to cite percentages? Does Chris keep saying that paragraph structure is something that our team needs to work on, or there are too many unambiguous or ambiguous phrases? So just note down what two or three of those kind of common feedback points are, because again, it can help to make your reading focused. 3 is to use the back to front technique that I talked about. So reading backwards from the last sentence to the first. Again, this does something cool to your brain, I think, that helps you view the document in a different way. Number 4, as I mentioned, leave a gap, a few days and at least a few hours, quite a lot of hours, to make sure that the document feels a bit less familiar to you. Believe me, I know what it's like to become very precious about a document and to feel very attached to it and passionate and committed to it. Sometimes that's obviously great in almost 9 out of 10 cases. Sometimes it can cloud our judgment about stuff. Sometimes we feel like certain sections are so important to the story we're telling and that everything will fall apart if they're gone. What you find sometimes 1 week, 2 weeks after you've handed in and you go on with the rest of your life, you look back at something and you go, oh yeah, that bit's really bloated. I don't know what I was talking about there. I went on for far too long about this specific element, or that section didn't fit there. And I think Chris maybe mentioned that before, but I thought it did. And I kept trying to make it fit. And I see now that it doesn't, because it's just time changes how you look at stuff. Sometimes you might look at it and think, did I write that? It's so strange. So leave a gap. Okay, if you are going to have something proofread, stop working on a document, hand it over to the proofreader who maybe hasn't worked on it in 1 or 2 days, and have them spend 5-6 hours going through these different stages of proofreading, editing, and revising. Listening to your writing, I've already said. You can also ask a friend to read out parts of the text over Zoom or in person. Ask them to read it. They might have no relation to the project, so they might say, oh, I don't know anything about leadership in this country. But those 2 sentences seem strange to me. I have no idea what do you mean. What do you mean? Then you're forced to explain yourself to a broad reader, someone who's interested but doesn't know about the topic. And as I said earlier, what you might find is that you explain it more simply then and more clearly than you have in those sections. And then you can go back and introduce some of your own voice and some of that clarity and simplicity to what you've written. Change location, I've mentioned already, very important, difficult in this time period, but if you can, print it out, go read it in a park, go read it in a public space, maintain the 1.5 meter distance, wear your mask in public transport, do all the right things, but change your relationship to it. Read it in a different context, use a pen, ask question marks, score out something that doesn't make sense, ask yourself questions. Do we have a good example for that? Could I ask this person later if they saw a good example of that in their interviews, because they were responsible for doing the transcripts? The other useful habit, I haven't mentioned this so forth, is using a ruler. And again, what this really forces you to do is it forces you to be so specific and purposeful in your reading. So you print it out on paper and you literally have a ruler over it and you go through it line by line, making sure that every single thing makes sense. And again, I'm really well aware, and I've been in your shoes where people say things like this and you think, oh yeah, like I'm going to do that, a ruler. Don't be crazy. I've got so many more important things to be doing for the CP. We need information. We need information. Remember, this isn't just technical stuff. This directly contributes to the quality of the content. How you present the content is sometimes just as important as the content itself. Okay? So the next thing is more of a kind of an active engagement and kind of active questioning of the text that I would like you guys to go through. And it's a good way to make sure that you're getting your message over to your reader. So this is a really good question that I said several times. Why does this matter? That's sometimes a good thing to do when you read through a section or a paragraph. Think, why does this matter? What is important about this? What is relevant about this whatsoever? So what I would say is make that even more specific. Why does this matter to leadership? If you've discussed post-Soviet stuff, colonial stuff, if you've discussed historical stuff, language stuff related to a country, what the currency is, how big the landmass is, at a certain point you need to transition to leadership and you need to ask yourself, why does this matter to the specific point of leadership in the country I'm investigating? If you answer that question, if you ask that question out loud to yourself or to another teammate and you hear nothing back, then that means that you're not sure why that sentence needs to be there. You're not sure why that paragraph is important, how it relates to leadership, and why it helps you to tell the story that you're trying to tell. If you keep feeling that certain sections are like that, trust your gut, trust my feedback sometimes, and think, okay, maybe we need to change this, take this out, and find new data or do more with what we have already. Okay? So for example, you could ask yourself when you're testing a paragraph, is the main point or idea clear? Is it clear what this actual topic is about? Is it about gender inequality? Is it about transformational leadership? Is it about transactional leadership, for example? You may then say, is it convincing? So sometimes you might have seen a comment from me saying, I'm just not convinced that this links to empathy, guys. Sorry. That's an example. I want you to ask yourselves that. Is this convincing? Does this really show what I'm saying it shows? Sometimes you need to perform and fake it till you make it. I get it. Big part of everyday life. But you can't kid a kidder, as they say. So sometimes if it's unconvincing, it will feel unconvincing to the reader. They'll probably screw up their face and go, is that an example of empathy? I don't know. I don't think so. And what that does is it stops the flow of your argument. Your reader started questioning stuff, and it maybe starts making them question the validity of other points you make. So the way you can make that better is by asking, is it supported by evidence? And is rightly or wrongly, if you have academic references that are helping to support the point that you're making, they give them more validity. These are people who have dedicated large parts of their life to studying the topic, to studying it in your specific country. If they've published on it, it also means that the quality of their ideas and the validity of their arguments have been judged by their peers, by fellow academics. So it's quality approved. So if you have those references, then that helps to make your points quality approved. Now, after that, you might want to then start to test the links between parts. Sometimes how stuff links together is just as important as what the actual separate paragraphs are about. So what you can ask yourself is things like, why is this here? How does this contribute to my line of reasoning? What is the link between this sentence and the sentence that came before? If there is no link, then you need to add a transitional sentence. or a phrase like furthermore, moreover. Another example of what people value in Bangladeshi leaders is, and all that does is signal to the reader, okay, that discussion is over, and we're now moving on to discuss a different aspect of leadership which is valued in Bangladesh. Then you're in your new paragraph structure. What's the topic about? What's the next general point? What concrete examples do you have to illustrate leadership in Bangladesh in relation to that specific point? Now, after that, you may want to engage in testing for quality. So you could ask yourself, for example, does this advance the argument? Does this point I make here actually contribute to the overall argument that I'm trying to make in this section? Does it contradict it? If it does contradict it, then maybe I need to address that contradiction now. I know that this contradicts what we said earlier in relation to our survey respondents, but there's perhaps a reason for this. The reason for this might be, as I said, that all the people that filled out the survey were males. And we've argued that this society is patriarchal, and therefore just because male managers don't believe there's gender inequality doesn't mean there isn't gender inequality in that country. And there are other researchers who have said that there are. That's an example of making sure things are polished and things are thorough. A very important question, I've mentioned this to a lot of teams, does it drift from the main point? Do you start with some good couple of paragraphs? The topics are very clear. You're talking about empathy, but then what happens is you introduce a different element, and before you know it, you're talking about hierarchy at the end of your empathy section. So again, look over that. Do you begin to drift? At what point does the discussion begin to drift? Can you change it? Can you change course? Do you need to take that section out? Do you need to summarize and conclude the previous paragraph better? Again, very important. Is there too much unimportant detail or description? So again, what you'll sometimes see from me is me just saying a redundant phrase, or I'm not sure this is needed here. I'm not sure this adds to your argument. Remember, you're telling a story. It's always going to be a partial story because you're not writing a PhD, which is 100,000 words long. It's a limited, partial story of what leadership is like in your country using empirical sources and secondary data. So keep that in mind. You need to try and you're only telling a story. It's not the full story of what a country is, why it is how it is, and why leadership is like it is. That's impossible for what you're doing. It's not what we're looking for. So what you need to see is there too much detail here that doesn't link to leadership, for example? If you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences that are talking about something that at first felt like it linked to leadership, but ultimately doesn't, then it needs to come out. Because what that's doing is it's stopping the flow of your argument. It's introducing other info that might be relevant about the country, but it isn't relevant for a management book. Okay, and then finally, does it repeat something? So are we repeating ourselves? And that's really useful to look at when you're trying to condense and shorten certain sections. Is there bits of repetition? If you've, having read it through slowly, if you recognize that you read it above, then maybe take it out when you mention it again. Okay, so trying to eliminate some of that repetition is also a really nice way of tightening your argument, of making it, improving the quality, as I say. It's not just a technical exercise. It directly impacts on the quality. And this is just another technique that you can use. Again, I do happen to think this one's actually a very useful technique. And what it involves printing it out. So you can print it out with different margins. So as you can hopefully see in the image, you have a wider margin on the left-hand side. And what this allows you to do is to write things in it. So for example, if you have 4 or 5 paragraphs in a hierarchy characterized leaders empathy section, I want you to write next to each of those paragraphs, what is this topic about? Summarizing 1 or 2 words. Is it about gender inequality? Is it about a shift in leadership styles? Is it about transformational leadership? Is it about transactional leadership? So write in 2 or 3 words next to it what the topic is. Give each of these a number. Okay, you can write these numbers down on sticky notes, for example, and post them next to the paragraphs on your page. What you can then do at that point is when you're reading through them is think, okay, now that you see the topics apart from your document, do they make sense? Does it make sense for gender to be here, for other topics to be here, And then we seem to be coming back to talk about gender again at the bottom. Okay, that's interesting. Might it be better to take this bit at the bottom and actually combine it at the top to talk about gender in both of these paragraphs, then move on to talk about something else? Now, some of that can be moving around post-it notes and doing it digitally, but some of you may want to cut out the paragraphs. So this is something David Bowie used to do in his lyrics. He would write lyrics and then cut them out like this, and then he would reorganize them so they didn't make sense, and so sometimes interesting accidents emerged. Nice phrases that were incoherent said something poetic. You can do that here with your drafts. Cut out the paragraphs, move them around. Does it make sense to flow from this to this? It does, because here we end by talking about a nice example of hierarchy. So maybe this bit down the bottom, we could then move on. This paragraph would now make more sense in relation to that. And now we can use a transitional phrase to link these two paragraphs together. So what this does is it helps you to focus on the structure, the flow, the ordering of things, and it also helps you to focus on, is this paragraph relevant? Is the content that we're describing in this paragraph relevant to the story that we're telling? If you honestly can't exactly say what a paragraph or what the topic sentence is of a paragraph, well, it's kind of transformational, but it's also kind of gender, it's also hierarchy, then that maybe means that you have too many things going on in that paragraph. And it might mean that you need to simplify it. Ideally, you should be able to summarize to yourself and someone else, this paragraph here is mainly about how leadership has changed in St. Martin over the last 25 years. The second paragraph was going to talk about how things were before it became no longer a colonial country, for example. Then you might think, chronology-wise, maybe it makes sense to talk about how things used to be at the beginning. Then the second paragraph would be about how leadership styles have changed in St. Martin once it gained its independent sovereign status, for example. So again, I fully understand sometimes the temptation might be, okay, these kind of look useful, Chris, but we have a lot to be getting on with in terms of content. For me, this is about content. It will make your argument stronger. It will make sure that you know when things are ambiguous. It will help you understand what info you still need. Do we need a good example to illustrate transformational leadership in Qatar? Hey, could we email that one survey respondent who said they'd be happy for us to email them and ask them if they have a good example of how transformational leadership is exercised in Qatar? Hey, the Saudi Arabian people said that there was no gender inequality in the survey. Could we ask 2 or 3 people why they think that's the case, or why other researchers are saying there is gender inequality? They might have a perspective on it. They might have a good example. When they email you back, you can lift that email and directly quote it in your CP. And then you can reference it as personal correspondence, which some of you are already doing. Okay, so I'm just going to stop screen sharing there and go back to the main PowerPoint. We are just wrapping up for the day, guys. I hope some of this is helpful. Yes. So what I really want to emphasize to you guys at the very, very end is about keeping your eye on the final price. So keep in mind the books that you can see here in the background are real books that were written by real students like you guys working in combination with Xander and myself, and also our proofreader in Italy and the book publisher. It's a collaborative effort, not necessarily in competition with one another. So sometimes I also recommend to some teams, have a look at other team CPs. If you're struggling with a particular section and you're kind of fed up of me commenting on it, have a look at another team CP, have a look at their section. Maybe they illustrate more practically what I'm talking about in the abstract. Obviously, I can't write the section and show you exactly how it should look. I give you recommendations, I say what it should kind of look like. But sometimes have a look at a team that's doing well and say, this better illustrates more what I think Chris is talking about. I see here the kind of information they're talking about here. We do have some of that actually, and we can use that now, or we don't have that kind of info. That could be a problem. How can we get that? And then, as I say, you can maybe look to email some of your scholars or some of your survey respondents and to directly ask them about some of the information you're missing. Can you help us with this? Why is this the case? We can't seem to find an answer. Why is there a contradiction here between what these two scholars say? What drove this shift from autocratic to more horizontal forms of hierarchical structures? These sorts of things. Okay, guys, on that point, I hope it's been useful for you guys today. I hope it's given you a clear illustration now of both the mindset that you need to be in over the next couple of weeks in terms of finishing a CP. No longer about getting feedback and building on it. Now we're really getting into making a final product that you guys can be proud of. And hopefully I've also provided you with some concrete, tangible tools and exercises that you can use. And again, you might not want to use all of them, but please try and engage with some of them. I really, really promise you it will help improve the quality of your CPs. And the better everyone's CPs is, the better the book is as a whole. We're not competing with one another. We're all going to have our names on this book in some shape or form. Okay? So keep that in mind. Nice to see you guys. It should be up at some point later today once I render it and edit it for Zoom. So other than that, yeah, I'll see you in some shape or form next week. Good luck with your third and fourth drafts or whatever you're on at the moment. Keep working hard to get survey respondents. Keep working hard to find leadership consultants and scholars to interview as well.